Section 41 of the Expedition of Humphry Clinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Expedition of Humphry Clinker by Tobias Smollett. Section 41. To Sir WATKIN PHILLIPS of Jesus College, Oxford. Dear Phillips, the moment I received your letter, I began to execute your commission. With the assistance of mine host at the Bull and Gate, I discovered the place to which your fugitive valet had retreated, and taxed him with his dishonesty. The fellow was in manifest confusion at sight of me, but he denied the charge with great confidence, till I told him that if he would give up the watch, which was a family piece, he might keep the money and the clothes, and go to the devil his own way at his leisure. But if he rejected this proposal, I would deliver him forthwith to the constable, whom I had provided for that purpose, and he would carry him before the justice without further delay. After some hesitation, he desired to speak with me in the next room, where he produced the watch with all its appendages, and I have delivered it to our landlord to be sent to you by the first safe conveyance. So much for business. I shall grow vain upon your saying you find entertainment in my letters, barren as they certainly are of incident and importance, because your amusement must arise not from the matter, but from the manner, which, you know, is all my own. Animated, therefore, by the approbation of a person whose nice taste and consummate judgment I can no longer doubt, I will cheerfully proceed with our memoirs. As it is determined we shall set out next week for Yorkshire, I went today in the forenoon with my uncle to see a carriage belonging to a coachmaker in our neighbourhood. Turning down a narrow lane behind Long Acre, we perceived a crowd of people standing at a door, which, it seems, opened into a kind of Methodist meeting, and were informed that a footman was then holding forth to the congregation within. Curious to see this phenomenon, we squeezed into the place with much difficulty. And who should this preacher be but the identical Humphry Clinker? He had finished his sermon and given out a psalm, the first stave of which he sung with peculiar graces. But if we were astonished to see Clinker in the pulpit, we were altogether confounded at finding all the females of our family among the audience. There was Lady Griskin, Mistress Tabitha Bramble, Mistress Winifred Jenkins, my sister Liddy, and Mr. Barton, and all of them joined in the psalmody with strong marks of devotion. I could hardly keep my gravity on this ludicrous occasion, but old Squaretoes was differently affected. The first thing that struck him was the presumption of his lackey, whom he commanded to come down, with such an air of authority as Humphry did not think proper to disregard. He descended immediately, and all the people were in commotion. Barton looked exceedingly sheepish. Lady Griskin flirted her fan. Mistress Tabby groaned in spirit. Liddy changed countenance, and Mistress Jenkins sobbed as if her heart was breaking. My uncle, with a sneer, asked pardon of the ladies for having interrupted their devotion, saying he had particular business with the preacher, whom he ordered to call a hackney coach. This being immediately brought up to the end of the lane, he handed Liddy into it, and my aunt and I following him, we drove home, without taking any further notice of the rest of the company, who still remained in silent astonishment. Mr Bramble, perceiving Liddy in great trepidation, assumed a milder aspect, bidding her be under no concern, for he was not at all displeased at anything she had done. "I have no objection," said he, "to your being religiously inclined, but I don't think my servant is a proper ghostly director for a devotee of your sex and character. If, in fact, as I rather believe, your aunt is not the sole conductress of this machine." Mistress Tabitha made no answer, but threw up the whites of her eyes, as if in the act of ejaculation. Poor Liddy said she had no right to the title of a devotee, that she thought there was no harm in hearing a pious discourse, even if it came from a footman, especially as her aunt was present, but that if she had erred from ignorance, she hoped he would excuse it, as she could not bear the thoughts of living under his displeasure. The old gentleman, pressing her hand with a tender smile, said she was a good girl, and that he did not believe her capable of doing anything that could give him the least umbrage or disgust. When we arrived at our lodgings, he commanded Mr Clinker to attend him upstairs, and spoke to him in these words: "Since you are called upon by the Spirit to preach and to teach, it is high time to lay aside the livery of an earthly master, and for my part I am unworthy to have an apostle in my service." "I hope," said Humphry, "I have not failed in my duty to your honour. I should be a vile wretch if I did, considering the misery from which your charity and compassion relieved me, but having an inward admonition of the Spirit—" "An admonition of the devil!" cried the squire in a passion. "What admonition, you blockhead? What right has such a fellow as you to set up for a reformer?" "Begging your honour's pardon," replied Clinker, "may not the new light of God's grace shine upon the poor and the ignorant in their humility, as well as upon the wealthy, and the philosopher in all his pride of human learning?" "What you imagine to be the new light of grace," said his master, "I take to be a deceitful vapour, glimmering through a crack in your upper story. In a word, Mr Clinker, I will have no light in my family but what pays the king's taxes, unless it be the light of reason, which you don't pretend to follow." "Ah, sir," cried Humphry, "the light of reason is no more in comparison to the light I mean than a farthing candle to the sun at noon." "Very true," said uncle. "The one will serve to show you your way, and the other to dazzle and confound your weak brain. Harkee, Clinker, you are either an hypocritical knave or a wrong-headed enthusiast, and in either case unfit for my service. If you are a quack in sanctity and devotion, you will find it an easy matter to impose upon silly women and others of crazed understanding, who will contribute lavishly for your support. If you are really seduced by the reveries of a disturbed imagination, the sooner you lose your senses entirely, the better for yourself and the community. In that case, some charitable person might provide you with a dark room and clean straw in Bedlam, where it would not be in your power to infect others with your fanaticism. Whereas, if you have just reflection enough left to maintain the character of a chosen vessel in the meetings of the godly, you and your hearers will be misled by a will-o'-the-wisp from one error into another, till you are plunged into religious frenzy, and then perhaps you will hang yourself in despair." "Which the Lord of his infinite mercy forbid!" exclaimed the affrighted Clinker. "It is very possible I may be under the temptation of the devil, who wants to wreck me on the rocks of spiritual pride. Your honour says I am either a knave or a madman. Now, as I'll assure your honour I am no knave, it follows that I must be mad. Therefore I beseech your honour upon my knees to take my case into consideration, That means may be used for my recovery." The squire could not help smiling at the poor fellow's simplicity, and promised to take care of him, provided he would mind the business of his place, without running after the new light of Methodism. But Mistress Tabitha took offence at his humility, which she interpreted into poorness of spirit and worldly mindedness. She upbraided him with the want of courage to suffer for conscience' sake. She observed that if he should lose his place for bearing testimony to the truth, Providence would not fail to find him another, perhaps more advantageous; and declaring that it could not be very agreeable to live in a family where an inquisition was established, retired to another room in great agitation. My uncle followed her with a significant look. Then, turning to the preacher, "You hear what my sister says. If you cannot live with me upon such terms as I have prescribed, the vineyard of Methodism lies before you, and she seems very well disposed to reward your labour." "I would not willingly give offence to any soul upon earth," answered Humphry. "Her ladyship has been very good to me ever since we came to London, and surely she has a heart turned for religious exercises, and both she and Lady Griskin sing psalms and hymns like two cherubims. But at the same time I'm bound to love and obey your honour. It becometh not such a poor ignorant fellow as me to hold dispute with a gentleman of rank and learning. As for the matter of knowledge, I am no more than a beast in comparison of your honour. Therefore I submit, and with God's grace I will follow you to the world's end, if you don't think me too far gone to be out of confinement." His master promised to keep him for some time longer on trial, then desired to know in what manner Lady Griskin and Mr Barton came to join their religious society. He told him that her ladyship was the person who first carried my aunt and sister to the tabernacle, whither he attended them, and had his devotion kindled by Mr W.'s preaching; that he was confirmed in this new way by the preacher's sermons, which he had bought and studied with great attention; that his discourse and prayers had brought over Mistress Jenkins and the housemaid to the same way of thinking. But as for Mr Barton, he had never seen him at service before this day, when he came in company with Lady Griskin. Humphry, moreover, owned that he had been encouraged to mount the rostrum by the example and success of a weaver, who was much followed as a powerful minister; that on his first trial he found himself under such strong impulsions as made him believe he was certainly moved by the spirit, and that he had assisted in Lady Griskin's and several private houses at exercises of devotion. Mr Bramble was no sooner informed that her ladyship had acted as the primum mobile of this confederacy, than he concluded she had only made use of Clinker as a tool, subservient to the execution of some design, to the true secret of which he was an utter stranger. He observed that her ladyship's brain was a perfect mill for projects, and that she and Tabby had certainly engaged in some secret treaty, the nature of which he could not comprehend. I told him I thought it was no difficult matter to perceive the drift of Mistress Tabitha, which was to ensnare the heart of Barton, and that in all likelihood my Lady Griskin acted as her auxiliary; that this supposition would account for their endeavours to convert him to Methodism, an event which would occasion a connection of souls that might be easily improved into a matrimonial union. My uncle seemed to be much diverted by the thoughts of this scheme's succeeding; but I gave him to understand that Barton was pre-engaged, that he had the day before made a present of an étui to Liddy, which her aunt had obliged her to receive, with a view, no doubt, to countenance her own accepting of a snuff-box at the same time, that my sister having made me acquainted with this incident, I had desired an explanation of Mr Barton, who declared his intentions were honourable, and expressed his hope that I would have no objections to his alliance; that I had thanked him for the honour he intended our family, but told him it would be necessary to consult her uncle and aunt, who were her guardians; and their approbation being obtained, I could have no objection to his proposal, though I was persuaded that no violence would be offered to my sister's inclinations in a transaction that so nearly interested the happiness of her future life; that he had assured me he should never think of availing himself of a guardian's authority unless he could render his addresses agreeable to the young lady herself, and that he would immediately demand permission of Mr and Mistress Bramble to make Liddy a tender of his hand and fortune. The squire was not insensible to the advantages of such a match, and declared he would promote it with all his influence, but when I took notice that there seemed to be an aversion on the side of Liddy, he said he would sound her on the subject, and if her reluctance was such as would not be easily overcome, he would civilly decline the proposal of Mr Barton, for he thought that in the choice of a husband a young woman ought not to sacrifice the feelings of her heart for any consideration upon earth. "Liddy is not so desperate," said he, "as to worship fortune at such an expense." I take it for granted this whole affair will end in smoke, though there seems to be a storm brewing in the quarter of Mistress Tabby, who sat with all the sullen dignity of silence at dinner, seemingly pregnant with complaint and expostulation. As she had certainly marked Barton for her own prey, she cannot possibly favour his suit to Liddy, and therefore I expect something extraordinary will attend his declaring himself my sister's admirer. This declaration will certainly be made in form, as soon as the lover can pick up resolution enough to stand the brunt of Mistress Tabby's disappointment, for he is without doubt aware of her designs upon his person. The particulars of the denouement you shall know in due season. Meanwhile, I am always yours, J. Melford. London, June 10th. End of Section 41.